Good morning, good morning. Welcome to another beautiful day here. I'm glad you're making it. It's day 20 of our parenting challenge, and today we're going to be looking at discipline and consequences. I first want to look at the word discipline. If we look at the root word, it's disciple, which means student. So therefore, if our kids are students, we are the teachers. So our role, therefore, is to guide and to teach. First and foremost, we need to teach our kids decision-making behaviors around their behaviors, right? It's their choice. So they need to learn how to make good decisions about the adaptive choices for behaviors and maybe the things that are going to get in trouble. They'll get in trouble for. There's a direct cause and effect from their behaviors, right? The responsibility of the behaviors is theirs. It's not ours. It's their choice. And yet we take on the responsibility of their behaviors so often, right? With punishing and threatening and all of these types of things. Our responsibility really is to help them learn what the adaptive choices are, but the behavior at the end of the day is their choice. And I've talked in the past about how we should respond. We wouldn't say this, but we act as though, you know what, it's your choice. You know, inside we're like, you better do exactly what I say. But, you know, it's no skin off our back. If we have that sort of indifferent, nonchalant approach to it, we will avoid all of those power struggles. So when we're teaching about behaviors and helping our kids make good choices, we need to be very crystal clear and consistent with consequences, right? That way they will always know that when X happens or when I do X, Y will always happen, right? So that's why the consequences and discipline kind of go hand in hand. They're teaching tools to help our kids learn the adaptive behaviors. So consequences are the outcomes of the behavior. So some consequences are punishing, and others are rewarding. Consequences can be very powerful teaching tools, but not when they are imposed with control and force. And that's why the nagging and lecturing and disciplining and all of those types of things don't really work very well. So consequences are really best when kids can see how their behavior directly caused the given result, right? So remember I talked about Ariel before when her father came and destroyed her grotto. She didn't see that her behavior caused that destruction. She just saw Dad was being a jerk. Right? So she's not learning the consequences of her behavior. Natural consequences are the most effective in helping kids learn from their behaviors. You don't eat dinner? Well, guess what? You get hungry. You don't wear a raincoat when you go outside and it's raining? Guess what? You get wet. Right? So those are the examples of natural consequences where you don't have to do anything. A big one at my house, you leave your stuff lying around, the dogs are going to eat it. So I don't need to tell them to clean up their stuff because that's what happens, right? I rely on natural consequences more than any other because it's really through those experiences that those natural consequences, it's not us getting in the way and being mean. Kids are going to learn from their behavior. And I don't ever rub it in their face, right? I don't ever say, well, you know, I told you to pick up your stuff because the dog's going to eat it, right? Because then I become the mean one and then they have anger to turn towards me and I don't want that to happen. Kids will develop responsibility and they will learn to think about making good decisions about their behaviors, especially when they're faced with those natural consequences. Now, we do need to remember that this part of the brain that makes the good behavioral choices and thinks about those consequences is still developing. It doesn't fully develop in typically developing boys until they're 30 or 40, in women, you know, early 20s. So we do have a long way. And then if there's any diagnoses like anxiety or ADHD or autism or anything like that, it's even more delayed. So they're going to make mistakes, right? And so we are there to support them through those mistakes, but it's through those mistakes that they're going to learn, right? And over time, I mean, the first time my daughter touched a hot pan, she never did it again. And it would have sucked. But if I was always there, no, don't touch, I would always have to be there. Don't touch, right? And I probably would have because she was little, but you know, it happened where I was looking away for a second, but she never had to do it again. So I never always had to be there. She didn't have to become dependent on me. Sometimes we do have to highlight the choices of the outcomes to help the learning process because sometimes, like I said, they don't always see those consequences. And especially when they get into teenage years, their brain isn't processing those consequences in the same way. But the important thing to remember when we're looking at natural consequences is we do not enforce them. They just happen, right? They happen naturally because kids chose one behavior over the other. Just like if they don't wear mitts, their fingers are going to freeze. But we can highlight, especially when they're young and especially when they're learning those processes, we can highlight these choices for our kids in a calm and respectful way, allowing them to choose their best. And when their hands get cold, again, it's no, I told you so. Now, I know that there are times where there really is safety concerns. So please hear me when I say don't let your kids really get hurt, right? Don't just let natural consequences happen. We do need to jump in. I'm the mom. Okay, you go outside, it's freezing cold, you're going to get cold. But if it's, instant freezing, instant frostbite, the choice is yours, and I'm going to talk about rights and responsibilities today, but if you want to go outside and have that freedom to go outside, the responsibility is that you need to dress warm because I don't want you to have frostbite, right? So there are times that we can step in, but unfortunately, we really don't give kids the opportunity to learn from their natural consequences because we're forcing those mitts on their hand or we're imposing the consequences, right? Even from the start, which we start threatening, well, you can't go outside. You're not going to go outside. You're not going to go tobogganing if you don't wear your mitts, right? We start doing those things and not giving them the opportunity to learn from the those natural consequences. And especially often what we do as parents, we're springing it on them in the heat of the moment, right when they're going to go outside, right? Or right after they've done a behavior. So they're never given that opportunity to think about their behavior in the first place. They just think about how mean we are, right? And now maybe even how we're going to retaliate. So time and time again, I've heard parents say that they've tried everything and nothing works. Part of the problem is that there's all sorts of consequences thrown at the child, right? And it's usually inconsistent. I've tried praise and I've tried punishment and I've tried this and that, and they're never tried long enough to establish, oh, that's the boundary, that's the expectation, that's the consequence. So it's just leading kids to confusion and poor regulation and behavior problems. And kids, their role from the time that they can start talking, they develop a counter will, their role is to push those boundaries and push those boundaries and push those boundaries. We need to set firm boundaries that they can't push back on because, like I've said in the past, that helps them with their confidence and security. But if we're changing things all the time, it just becomes really confusing for kids. When we're looking at punishments and consequences, we know research shows hitting kids is not very effective. In the short term, we might be able to stop the behavior, but over a long time, it's really limiting their development in all areas, and it can just lead to worse behaviors. The cognitive functioning, their social emotional functioning, their abilities to learn and to reason, all of those are limited when we're hitting. And we're actually finding similar results now with yelling. So just keep that in the back of your mind. I'm not a yeller, but there's times where I'm like, right? It's hard not to. But if we're doing that consistently, it is affecting our kids' development. I've already talked about punishment already and how it doesn't teach. And the other thing with punishment, it's not that it's just not teaching. We often, punish our kids for unintentional behaviors, right? Have your kids, you've ever asked them, okay, buddy, go brush your teeth, right? Or go clean your room, and you've asked them to go do something, and then you find them 20 minutes later knee deep in something. Maybe they're playing Lego, or they found, who knows, a piece of fluff, right? Who knows what they go and do. But they didn't get done the task that you've asked them to do. And then you start yelling, why didn't you do it? It wasn't intentional, right? They just got distracted. And so now they're getting in trouble. And from their perspective, they're like, I don't even know what I did wrong. And then they start internalizing that. I can't even remember to go brush my teeth. What's wrong with me? Right? When they just, I'm so stupid that I can't even do that because they just got distracted. And then we have this defiance and all of those other behaviors that I've talked about in the past. But they really do internalize those messages that they are bad kids, right? And then it comes out with behaviorally, but that's essentially what the message is. So we have the natural consequences, which are the best. That's what I'm highlighting. But we do sometimes need to have logical consequences where maybe natural consequences aren't coming into play, and we do need to step in. But these are still beneficial, and we still need to make sure that we are teaching our kids, right? That's the whole point of discipline, it's teaching. So we got to make sure that they're beneficial in how we establish them and how we implement them. Logical consequences should they're called logical because they should fit with the behavior, right? If you spill the milk, you got to clean it up, right? It's not, if you spill the milk, you don't get iPad for a week, right? And oftentimes when we impose logical consequences, even though that they're meant for a teaching tool, we use them in a very controlling way, right? And that's where we threaten. Remember, if this happens, if you don't get along, you're not going to play your iPad or whatever it is. It's very controlling, and we're holding it over their heads. And when the consequences aren't related to the behavior, then it's just punishing, and kids are not going to learn. It's just you are being unfair, and they're going to stew in that anger and that resentment, and it's just leaving you guys as the bad guy. So yes, if the kids are fighting over the iPad, then maybe the iPad is something that we need to look at. But if the iPad is what you're using as a reward or consequence, completely unrelated, then it makes it a bit trickier to learn from my behavior, right? It just makes it all tricky. So we've worked on the problem solving and the listening. Problem solve with your kids and come up with agreed upon consequences. Usually kids are more strict than parents, and they're harsher in their consequences than you would have been. So problem solving through this. Hey bud, every time I ask you to get off the iPad, it's a big freak out. Or hey bud, every time we sit down to do some writing, it's a big freak out. Let's talk about what we're going to do, create a plan, and then the consequences of those plans. Then they're feeling empowered by being part of that process. And when they're part of that process, they're more likely to A, understand why the rules are there, and B, following through with those rules. Kids also need to know that the consequences are going to be there before they behave, right? They need to know before I make a decision on how I'm going to behave, I know exactly what the consequence is going to be, so they can actually think about their behaviors. Oftentimes we start, like I said, threaten in the heat of the moment or bring up consequences in the heat of the moment. There's no blood to hear in their prefrontal cortex to hear that message, right? So it's just going to be a big fight, or afterwards. And then that's mean too, because kids really had no idea, and now they can't take accountability for their actions because they weren't aware of what was happening in the first place. So if you do try to impose consequences as they are behaving and using them threateningly, if you don't listen, I'm going to take your iPad away, or after their behavior without them knowing, they're not going to learn anything. They need to know those consequences first so they can make a good decision to behave. And I will put up the link for today's worksheets, and it's tips and tricks and just talking about consequences and things to think about, because there's a lot more than what I can say here. Before, I've talked about a democratic approach to parenting, which is very important when we think about consequences. Here, it's about those rights and privileges, right? In our society, we have rights and privileges and freedoms, but they all come with responsibility. As adults, we have the rights and freedoms to go and use these parks, but we have to pay taxes, right, as a responsibility. For our kids, it could look like you want to go ride your bike or you want to go scooter. Cool, but you need to wear your helmet. That's your responsibility. So when you focus on natural consequences and then problem solving and looking at this responsibility, you are disciplining very effectively, and you are teaching, right? And when we discipline, we're clearly communicating those expected behaviors. No, just be respectful. That's too vague. What does be respectful mean, right? What does respectful look like? It's eye contact. It's relaxed and open, a quiet voice, a soft tone, a soft face, not a, Mom, please get me, my snack. That's not being respectful, right? So maybe she said the words nicely, but it's everything else that's going on. So we have to show our kids what our expected behaviors are, model them rather than just telling them. And then noticing when they are being respectful, because there's lots of times that they are, and we might not be pointing out, hey, that's what respect looks like, right? So then they have firsthand experience to say, hey, oh, I am respectful. I am a respectful kid, because maybe they're only hearing I'm disrespectful when they're disrespectful. So then they just internalize that. So for today, I want you to try to use natural consequences as much as you can. Look for those opportunities. If you do need to step in, see if there's logical consequences that you can create, but collaborate with your kid about those things. So if there's gridlock things that you're always fighting about, sit down and say, look, this is something I noticed we're really fighting. Have a little family meeting, talk about it, brainstorm, come up with a plan. And if you're coming up with a plan, that's when you can have consequences. So for example, I just had a kiddo that I was working with who, all kids have transitions coming off of screens, right? It's just a thing. And I can go into that. Actually, I will go into that when I talk about screens in a few days. But, we made a great plan, and he was all on board about the plan, about how he can be his master overseer of screen times. But with that freedom of having screens as much as he wants on the weekend comes the responsibility of, eating at some point during the day and getting off cool. So my girls know we can't watch anything after 7 o'clock because they lose their mind. I've tried to give them time and time and time again responsibility of, we can watch TV a little bit later, but you got to go to bed cool afterwards. And it's just too much for their brain to handle. They weren't able to hold that responsibility. And so now we've got that rule. We don't watch TV after 7 o'clock, right? So there's lots of ways that we can look for responsibilities, right? If you want a pet, fantastic. Your responsibility is to take good care of it. And I've talked about the backpack, me making lunch for my daughter. I'm happy to make lunch, but your responsibility is to give me that lunch kit. So there's lots of different ways that we can look at that. And we need to let our kids decide on their behavior, and we need to be okay with that. So they might make the wrong choice, but then we're going to follow through. But we're not going to warn them and hang over them and threaten them beforehand, because then we're controlling them and we're just going to end up in a power struggle, and they're going to see that that they are the loser, right? And I've already talked about that, and they're not going to trust us to make those decisions. So using these consequences is another way. If you're just trying to use it as a way to control your kids, it's going to backfire. The other thing is that no one's perfect. Your kids are going to make mistakes. They are going to make poor behavioral choices. So it's not about, I told you so. It's about talking about afterwards. What did you learn from this? How are we going to fix this mistake? That's the biggest thing. How are we going to fix it? So if they are disrespectful and they're hurtful to you, how are we going to fix this so we can repair our relationship rather than getting angry, because then there's no repairing. Therefore, the consequences too should be really short, so kids have the chance to try again in the near future. So practicing and learning from their behaviors is really important to help shape these positive behaviors. So go try finding all those natural consequences that you can, and if you need to impose logical consequences, sit down with your kids and see what makes sense and what's fair to them. Have an awesome day, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye-bye.